Alright, everybody, we should be live for our next discussion here on the Game Wisdom channel. I am, of course, Josh Blazer, and for today's stream, we're going to be having another one of our Video Game of the Month kind of discussion casts. Joining me is frequent guest as well as game developer on Epic Tavern, Tomo Moriwaki. How are you doing?
Hi guys, glad to be here.
It's great to have you on. We just did our roundtable about, I think, a week ago, and that should be going up again or the record for should be up in a few days. I think that was another really great discussion we had too.
Agreed.
All right, but hey, Sharky, but for today's discussion, we are going into action roguelike design, and specifically, we're going to be focusing on the recently released Hades. And I've been playing a whole lot of it. And how about yourself, Tomo?
I played a bunch a couple months ago, and been taking a brief look at it just yesterday to kind of catch up for today's conversation. I'm also kind of interested to talk about kind of broader context. So there's just some basic game development things about, well, really, I guess any Supergiant game that's worth talking about. Their studio puts out very sophisticated stuff.
Mm-hmm. And like with Supergiant, they've done a really great job ever since like going back as far as Bastion at really combining gameplay with narrative.
So they're batting 1,000, huh?
Mm-hmm. And definitely want to talk a little more also about kind of this idea of action roguelikes as well, because it's something that I focus on in my third book, and about kind of this like changing of what it means to make a roguelike for a lot of people. And I mean, Hades is certainly not a turn based isometric RPG by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, I mean, and for I mean, Supergiant has kind of specialized in the lost art of the kind of 2D action game in so many ways. I mean, maybe there are plenty of other titles that kind of contribute to that, but Supergiant has been very consistent and has kind of been it's been their signature. And, depending on which of the games we're talking about, I guess between like Bastion and Transistor and Hades and the one whose name I always forget.
Pyre?
Yeah, exactly. Uh, they kind of take different facets of that experience.
Yeah. And I guess like with Pyre, I guess like stay on that for a second. Did you have a chance to play that one?
Just a tiny bit. It's the one I played the least. It was a period of time where I was doing fundamentally less research, and so I always kind of almost forget. It's like a black spot in my recollection of Supergiant's history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know it's definitely been like that's the one that I think kind of hurt or wasn't the most well received of their games.
Yeah, it's true. Well, I mean, because all the other games did so well,
Mm-hmm.
and in so many ways are like super memorable as well, right? I mean, I don't think anybody who's played Bastion is ever going to forget the way that voiceover kind of
Mm-hmm.
goes along with playing the game, and the fact that the game was so very well balanced. Maybe it seems simple when you start playing it, but then the more you play it, the more you want to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and Transistor is crazy beautiful.
Oh yes.
And I mean, Hades, as we'll talk about, I'm sure soon, has got all kinds of very interesting stuff.
Mm-hmm. And with I'm just like trying to think of like how to get started on this. There's a lot of different ways we can go at it. I guess. I
Well, I mean, let's
guess.
just why don't you give us a little bit of an overview on your definition of action roguelike.
Okay. So with like this idea of an action roguelike, it definitely like we look at kind of the roguelike being more or traditional roguelike being more on the RPG side and dealing with, replayability and a run based goal. An action roguelike kind of approaches it again from more of a real time kind of focus. Now, here is a tough question because I've been having some trouble struggling with this myself. Would you consider Hades to be an example of an action roguelike or an action roguelite? That the light part, of course, being the focus on that there is a huge amount of persistence in Hades, and that's kind of one of the big things that I think kind of draws this distinction. Because when we look at kind of action roguelikes like Enter the Gungeon, The Binding of Isaac, even something like Dead Cells, a lot of the game is done, or a lot of the focus is on each individual run. But Hades really, I think, dials up to 11 in terms of this overall overarching sense of persistence, not just in the gameplay, but the story. And I think we definitely have to spend a few minutes on about the story. I think in a in a little while.
So, I mean, I would say that it actually in some ways it has almost equivalent number of elements that match roguelike as well as roguelite, right? It's got definitely has I mean, I think is it roguelite that is ultimately about the kind of the carryover, right?
Hmm.
The the progression. And what's weird is it really should be called Rogue Next instead of Roguelite because it's really the legitimate kind of, starting around 10 years ago, the kind of rush of new development and new titles that were in the rogue-like genre, right? And it took the next step. The next step was get you to play over and over again in that kind of permadeath situation by creating long-term persistence. Um, so it really should be called, I mean, like, see, because it's like when you hear roguelite, it sounds like they toned it down. But really, I mean, in so many ways, it was the step that pushed the genre forward. And for sure, you might want to say that what's interesting about Hades is more in the roguelite category. And of course, it has many rogue-like elements. All of them really, except in sometimes people get caught up that hardcore mode means you lose all your progress, that you gotta start fresh, that it's gotta be punishing. Um, and it's not like that was a feature of the past. It was an accidental fallout of not being able to track stuff. But aside from aside from harshness, it has all the roguelike elements, I think, as well.
And for all the traditional roguelike fans who are about to send me angry messages, direct them at Tomo there.
Yes, I'm on board. I'll have that conversation all day. To be fair, you'll find that I categorize based on whether it matches, not whether there's some feeling inside it that I don't think like I'm not one to disqualify something from a category provided it matches all the important pieces.
Mm. Yeah, and I think I would. And that's the thing, like, when we talk about traditional roguelite kind of design, it doesn't really, I think, hit the same heights as roguelikes. Just in terms of the amount of replayability and the amount of variance that can be put into it. But with something like Hades, so much of that game has worked really well in term excuse me, in terms of providing that long-term play. I mean, this is a game that it does, I think, one of the best jobs of, keeping somebody invested, run after run, story beat after story beat.
Yeah, it's there's an interesting thing about Hades that I feel like there's so many developers out there that want to or kind of dream about creating an RPG RPG connection to action gameplay elements.
Mm,
Um, kind of a clear example would be even going back to like Devil May Cry and unlocking new moves or something, or kind of like God of War, right? That's kind of the beginning of some of those efforts. But then they start to get more sophisticated, although maybe unbalanced. If you take like Skyrim, for example, or Oblivion, where I'm going to do a little bit more damage, I'm going to swing my sword a little bit faster, I'm going to move a little bit more faster, I'm going to take a little bit less damage. This weird over the course of the last maybe 20 or so years, right? There's like this really a thread of trying to bring together RPG gameplay and action gameplay together. And it's always been tricky, and there's always been problems or things that didn't quite match up or things that didn't quite work out. And in the case of Hades, I think that it's been brought together in an elegant and sophisticated way that probably, in terms of how clean it is and how well it works, I,
Hmm.
I don't really see a lot of, I can't think of a game that does it better, really.
Yeah, I mean, I played a few other like action roguelike style games lately, like Undermine and Going Down, that just released I think a few days ago, and it's very hard to play those games now while I'm still playing Hades and really getting into that one. And it really is a complete package that I think really elevates it.
Well, and something to add to this idea of bringing together RPG and action. So, if you think about your thought process with turn-based, is that you're analyzing, you're creating like a spreadsheet, and you're looking for optimal choices, and you're looking out for maybe consequences. Like I can take that guy out next but the next turn I'm going to lose the guy, so that's not a valid choice. Um, and in the context of action, it's very different, right? In the context of action, you build theories. You're like, I think I could block that one enemy's attack with the shield, and then do an attack and hold and dash. And I have a feeling that that'll allow me to do a certain amount of damage to that enemy, which will mean in two more attacks I could take that guy out and remove him as a threat, and that'll make the rooms that have the two skulls go better than the other than it has. I've been having difficulty with that, so I'm going to go ahead and try that out. And now you have to kind of test the theory, and you have to master the theory as well, like kind of like from a skill standpoint, right? And so suddenly that's a very complex situation that you have to try over and over again as well. And I mean, so much of what's kind of genius about Hades is that every one of its features are in this really clean alignment towards improving the replay value, continuously making the more time you spend, make the next amount of time you spend more valuable. Because now I have this super finicky little crazy theory I want to try out, and it turns out not to work, but the mental stimulation of it is extremely engaging. And
Hmm.
the fact that some of my crazy theories work make it so that I keep wanting to try things out. Every time if I get 5% more damage, well, that's kind of a lot, but even 1% more damage can sometimes
Hmm.
cross a threshold and change my interactions with the particular AIs for the enemy types, which I mean, that itself, like, yeah, like you're saying, like it's the complete package. It's enemy design, the tuning in that enemy design, it being elegantly designed to handle the progression of the character and its abilities. It's extraordinary work, really.
Hmm. Yeah, and the amount of variance with the weapon designs and then the boons themselves is definitely, I think, a major part of kind of the success of this gameplay. Because it kind of feels in a way like an evolution from Rogue Legacy, if you remember that game.
Yes.
Like, for those of you who didn't play Rogue Legacy, you start each run kind of like your major decisions are made before the run begins. You know, what character you're choosing, what your main weapon is going to be, armor, passive, etc. And then the run kind of goes from there. The problem with that design is that once your run starts, there's no other impact on how you play. Like, how that character behaves the first minute of the run is how it behaves at the end. With Hades, what they did was, yes, your primary form of damage, i.e., your weapon, you choose that before you jump down. But then all the boons and all the various upgrades you get, that then kind of pushes and pulls your strategy in different directions. Like an example, I played and I took the shield, and one of the aspects of the shield turns into this kind of like short range, like almost like a detonating bomb. Like it just like stays in there and it's just like little bits of damage. So I combine it with Poseidon's enhancement that pushes enemies back. So then the shield just like slowly moving around, knocking everything backwards and then causing additional damage. And I just have to just stay back, or I just like to keep knocking the enemy back into the shield explosion.
Well, it's interesting. That describes, right, the other side of the coin. Like on one side of the coin, I'm thinking about what I'm going to do. I'm choosing the shield because I have a particular set of tactics that I'm considering, and I'm trying to overcome the challenges that I've been able to identify from playthrough to playthrough. But then in the course of that playthrough, right, there's a random, not completely random, right, but there's sets of choices that I can make that'll branch the current experience. And now it's like, well, oh, how can I best maximize these three choices? How can I pick something that gets me what I want? To
Hmm.
be fair, a lot of the choices we make, we know what we're going to make, right? It's like, oh
Yeah.
no, I'm going to pick the dash that knocks him away and does dash for damage because that makes my dash does damage now, and that's really useful. And I always pick that when I can. But then eventually something uncommon shows up, right? And you're like, this will totally change the playthrough of this run.
Hmm.
And do I want to explore that, right? And depending on your state of mind, you can go like, I'll go with what I know, or I'm going to try something new and crazy. And
Hmm.
again, because the runs aren't too long, trying something crazy there's a huge cost to it, and and if it works out, it's a ton of fun, and it's kind of fun even when it doesn't.
Yeah. And so much of that unpredictability, I think, is a very big point about what is the appeal of Hades over, I think, some of the other action roguelikes that we've had a chance to play. And I think part of that problem is just, again, how many, I guess, how many different flavors can you build an action roguelike around? Like, when we talk about traditional roguelikes, their advantage about being turn based and being more on the RPG side is that you can, change a lot of those aspects. And, there's not as much in terms of, I think, the gameplay implications as if you're asking the player to do things in real time. And I guess, did you have a chance to? I think, I don't know if we talked about, did you play Dead Cells?
Oh yeah, yeah, of course, of course.
I guess, how would you compare like Dead Cells to Hades if you could, in terms of, I guess, like wanting to replay those two games?
Well, I mean, in so many ways, Dead Cells is going to be about continuing to master the complexities of its control scheme, and and you get deeper and deeper and deeper, and you get kind of more and more skilled. It's a little bit more kind of has kind of like, some elements conventional platformer sort of in some ways,
Hmm.
conventional skill experience. Hades is a lot flatter, right? The depth takes longer to get to, but there's a lot more simple stuff like what's a good way to describe this? Think of like Dead Cells as kind of like a deeper, narrower drill,
Hmm.
and Hades is kind of like a wider kind of like shovel, I guess. But you know what I'm saying. You know where I'm going with it is that like Hades is is kind of like rounder and shinier and easier to understand in some ways. And at every point of the path that you kind of go down it, your brain has a fewer choices to make, and those choices make sense. And the ones you don't understand, you don't really worry about because you don't really get it. Whereas in the case of Dead Cells, there's all these things like when you can't pull something off, you kind of know exactly what you got to do.
Hmm.
um, a little more super Meat Boy in some ways, or that's not the right analogy. A little more kind of like um, well, I guess Super Meat Boy, Binding of Isaac, those kinds of skill games were. Oh no, Celeste, a little more Celeste,
Hmm.
in its kind of skill path.
Yeah. And yeah, I think like with Dead Cells, the skill ceiling or the skill floor, I think, is higher than in Hades because there's just
Yeah,
so much more you have to do. And I think Hades does a better job kind of like drip feeding its complexity. Like, there's so many different little facets that you can use to make the game easier or harder.
sorry.
That's all right. That the game kind of allows you to embrace. So, one of the big things that there is God mode. That for players who aren't as good at the action gameplay, you can turn this on. This provides, I think, every time you die, you get a new passive or you get an improved passive buff. So eventually, you're going to beat this game. You're going to be, it may take you a lot longer than somebody who plays the game really well, but you're going to be able to see the story of the game through no matter what. Now, if you want to make things harder, there's of course Hell mode that basically starts you right away with the pack of punishment and leaves certain ones of those options completely on. Like for instance, when I play it, I have lost iframes. So there are no iframes when I play Hades. So if like five things hit me, I'm getting hit by all five of those things. I don't even know what it's like to play Hades without iframes anymore. Because I've just turned on Hell mode, never turned it off.
Yeah, it's I mean, well, Hades has the capability of being extraordinarily difficult, but it generally is not, right? And
Mhm,
um, I think that describing the kind of skill floor is the right kind of difference point, in that kind of everything about Supergiant games is really clearly designed for everybody, even if strangely enough, Dead Cells kind of sells more. I think something about the simplicity of Dead Cells, it's very straightforward. There is no question. There's nothing confusing about Dead Cells.
mhm,
it's just it's just hard sometimes. You just like there's a limit that you'll run into, and if you want to get over it, you got to muscle through it. You got to do put in the time,
mhm,
and you have to want it. Rather, in the case of maybe Hades, which is so elegantly a little more kind of like a smoother ramp, it kind of tricks you into
mhm,
committing to getting over the next hump with some smoothing efforts and the right amount of at least the right amount of minimum progress should you have an extremely bad run.
mhm. And yeah, like it's as hard as you want to make it. I think is a really good encapsulation when it comes to Hades compared to I think a lot of the other action roguelikes. And like when I'm thinking about that, I go back to something like Undermine. And Undermine is another action roguelike. That one, the persistence is very much just always on this constant scaling up. That every time you finish a run, you spend your gold, you get more passive bonuses. And
Yeah.
the game very much feels designed that you have to do that. That you need those upgrades, or a game becomes less enjoyable. And like with Hades, it feels like I think this is part of the advantage of the fact that so much of the run affecting stuff occurs within the run itself. And I want to talk about the mirror in a second, but like keeping away from the mirror for like another minute. That so much of kind of your advantages and disadvantages comes from what boons show up. If you get Zeus, for instance, and you start, rocking Chain Lightning, that's going to give you a different advantage than if you get Ares and get his Doom uh, debuff. And it doesn't feel like, while I'm unlocking a lot of stuff through the passives, I don't necessarily feel like I'm being chained to them as much compared to Undermine or Dead Cells with its Souls Unlock system.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a lot more flexible, and they do something that I like to describe as kind of like as rules obfuscation. Um, they don't want you in some ways to understand the system. They want the natural flow of playing to create a sequence of skill gain and incremental improvements through the mirror, lucky intersections of improvements through the from the mirror with the boons to create spikes of power, and that like a thoughtless approach to playing still produces an interesting pattern of interactions. Whereas if like by not obfuscating that in the context of like Dead Cells and Undermine, um, you understand full well that you need two more hit points and you need to do +1 damage. Because
Mhm,
once you do that, then that enemy over there, you'll kill him before he kills you in your mindless way of interacting with it. And part of you understands that if you just got a little more sophisticated with the mechanics, that you'd be able to take him out right now. But it's hard for you, and that skill really maybe you don't have an affinity for that skill interaction. So you just you just kind of bang your head against Dead Cells until you can make that step. Or well, Undermine more so because Dead Cells is a little more kind of more seriously a reset when you die. But and then on the other hand, uh, Hades is you don't know any of that. You're like, I think I have more hit points. That seems useful, and I can feel it. I can go further in a given run because of that. Um, but then next thing you know, right, as you gain more hit points, you start realizing how much more beneficial it is to heal. You're like,
Hmm.
oh, those look really exciting, and you don't have to be super conscious of it, right? You just like the healing option better. And if you were to spend a lot of points on health, you would those would look even more attractive, right? So now there's an interaction, a future interaction between your choices in the mirror and the choices you get in a given run. You know,
Hmm.
then next thing you know, you go down the improvements to the curse, right? And suddenly the mechanics of those gems just start mattering way more to you.
Hmm.
And then there was a weapon maybe that you just overlooked because it's stronger when you have a more effective relationship with the gems, and then you go back to it going like, oh, suddenly this is really interesting. At the time I thought the spear was stupid, or it just didn't work for me because tappity tappity tap on individual guys. Even though that worked well, I really suck at dealing with like, broadly distributed many enemies, and so the spear wasn't working for me. And then the shield ended up becoming nice because I could block all those incoming attacks or whatever.
Yeah, and I think one of the like subtle, like brilliant aspects of Hades, I think that gets it right, is that there are very few, I guess I could say, like quote unquote, pure upgrades in the persistent aspects of the game. Like again, going back to Undermine, it is always a upward scale. I'm going to get more health. I'm going to get more attack. I'm going to get more range attack or range distance on my weapon. And when you design and balance a game around that, it means that you have to accommodate for those bonuses. And often lead to like fights and bosses being very, damage spongy, or, all of a sudden you're doing fine, then we just up the enemy stats, you're dead, kind of thing. With Hades, you don't see, and I've poured over the mirror upgrades, both variants that you can unlock with it. And there's very few that are just saying, this is great, you must take this every time. And while some of it, I couldn't imagine not playing Hades without having, the extra life from a stubborn defiance. There's always that thought in the back of your mind of, what if I take this upgrade instead of this one? How does that change? It's not a case of I need to take this, or my run is ruined, kind of thing. Like, as a really good example, there's a buff on the mirror. I'm not sure if you got this one yet. That it gives you increased damage if an enemy is being affected by two debuffs at the same time. And it is a huge bonus. When that thing is maxed out, it gives you a 40% increase in your damage. And like I said, any time you get pure damage upgrades in Haze is a huge deal. But again, it's counterbalanced by the fact that you need to get two debuffs. And that can be very hard depending upon what boons drop. But it's not just about getting a boon. You need to get a boon that specifically will affect the enemy like that.
Oh yeah, yeah, totally. And then you start, but then now you're on the lookout for it,
Mm-hmm.
right? It becomes it's changed the way you look at everything. And that's really, I mean, that's great. It's and it's not like an incremental change, right? It's
No.
not like um uh I see seven enemies. Before I used to think seven enemies were scary, and now I finally crossed to thinking seven enemies is okay and eight enemies is scary, right? It's like a fundamental shift in your approach. Now everything's different. That big guy is not a problem because
Mm-hmm.
I have the right to put the two debuffs on. I can burn him down. What's
Mm-hmm.
interesting about like damage bonuses in some cases because of the nature of like one hit versus two hit versus three hit,
Yep.
it allows you to kill big guys, and it really changes your interaction with the big guys, but doesn't change your interaction with the little guys.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's just one of the many little details about the game that are fascinating, right? That you get that the upgrades change your approach to a room full of bad guys, and not in this kind of even sort of way. It's like very noisy. Like you've learned the rules well enough, and now suddenly, you know,
Mm-hmm.
a field of seven guys that three of them pop out as obvious. You got to take them out first, and then for the 2 hours playing up until that point, you just saw this mass of guys. It was confusing and you knew it was hard.
Mm-hmm. All right, Chris. Good luck with the baby challenge there. Yeah, and I think to its credit, and somebody on one of the forums I visited described Hades as being very linear, and I think that is a very, excuse me, I think that is not. I think that's a good description of the game. It's not considered, I think, a negative in this aspect because normally when we talk about a linear approach, we mean that the game is played. This, the game is repetitive. It's the same thing. Run one, run 100, run 1,000. But I think the linearity works in a way that it provides a very much an established framework for how you're going to play through this game. That, the first area, you have very common enemies. Most of them are going to be melee oriented, with exceptions of the witches. When you get to Elysium, you know to expect all of a sudden, armored guys are going to revive. There's a lot more range and more dodging. And you kind of have to, again, figure out what you want your run to be. And that's where the boons come in. That's where, what your primary weapon's going to be. And it reminds me, I think, a little bit of like Monster Train. I think we spoke about either Monster Train or Slay the Spire on a previous episode. And Monster Train embraces that linearity that I'm going to have 8 battles in Monster Train. I'm not going to have 7, I'm not going to have 9. It's going to be 8 battles, boss fight, win or lose, the run ends. It's what happens in between those locked elements that gives the game its variance. Okay, maybe I get this really great relic that gives me double attacks on my demons. Maybe I get a spell upgrade. How about slay the monster spire there, Sharky?
Yeah.
And
Well, oh,
yeah,
go ahead. Keep going.
I
Keep
was
going.
just gonna say, and it's kind of like you're embracing a fixed pattern or a fixed progression, and then figuring out all the little ways you can stretch it out within those points.
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree with that statement, and it kind of inspires me to make another point here, in that something that happens in the flow, uh, amid this stretching that you just described, is Slay the Spire like kind of moments of overpowered, right? When
Mm-hmm.
a weird intersection, an unexpected convergence of abilities comes together, and suddenly everything gets much easier. You became much more powerful, right? And you're like, oh man, if only. And then if it's good enough, you felt it. If it felt good enough, you start chasing that rare case for a while, not realizing that you really can't make it happen because that intersection is very unlikely.
Mm-hmm.
I honestly can't even remember any of those intersections anymore, but I do remember occasionally, like, you get into the second area or towards the end of the second area, and you've just accumulated enough stuff. You took one of those disadvantages that give you a big advantage, but it's not a big disadvantage because of the way you're set up, and suddenly you're tearing things apart.
Yeah.
And you're stacking up gold, and you're just like, oh, this is easy, and then suddenly it gets really hard and you die.
Yeah. In a run I just did last night, I got the bolt, and I got the hammer upgrade that makes it do friendly fire, but increases damage by like 300%. And then I
Yeah.
stack Poseidon's special that improves damage on specials even more. And then suddenly, the grenade was doing 1,000 points of damage to anything, including me. And then
That's
it's
awesome.
like, and then like for a second, like I'm playing like, would it really do 1,000 points of damage to me if it hits? Like, do I really want to test that? I'm like, no, better not risk that in a roguelike. And then I thought, what if I get the upgrade that gives us splits in like 5 rockets? And all of a sudden it's like 5 instant kill rockets and everything bouncing around, trying to die, and I'm trying to dodge them at the same time.
Yeah, no, and there's these moments of kind of like joyful, chaotic craziness
Mm-hmm.
that occur. And they happen, strange enough, they happen at just the right rhythm, right? It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
happen too much, doesn't happen too little. It's always good. Like, it always feels exciting because it doesn't happen too frequently. Like, in a lot of ways, if you can intentionally manufacture that situation at will, it'll rapidly lose its value, because
Mm-hmm.
either it'll lead you to overpowering the game, and you'll just do that, right? If you can win, you will. Um, or you'll use up all of its power, and the things that it can do, unless it can lead to kind of an overall win state, you abandon it because it's chaotic but can't get you where you need to go.
Hmm. And I guess here's a question. I'm curious about what you think. That when it comes to Haze, it doesn't feel like, again, going back to this idea of like the overpowerness and when it shows up, that it doesn't feel as spiky compared to something like Enter the Gungeon or The Binding of Isaac, where you can have a run just completely change, almost like on a drop of a hat by picking up like that one item, like in Binding of Isaac, getting Brimstone or Epic
Mm.
Fetus or any of the other like crazy bullet or damage affecting powers. In Hades, it never feels, I think, as pronounced. At least from what I've played of it so far. I'm just curious what you think on that.
Well, I would generally agree. Like, you could describe Binding of Isaac as a one step to extreme power.
Hmm.
And maybe you could describe like Slay the Spire to like 3 steps to extreme power. And then you describe Hades as 8 steps to
Yeah.
extreme power. So there are these pathways, right? And you're kind of trying to keep your options open and going as you get to know them.
Hmm.
There's so many pieces of the puzzle that have to come together to create those overpowered moments that, one, they only tend to happen deeper in the game, and then two, if you're just randomly choosing, it's fairly infrequent. And then even when you're intentional about it, it's not guaranteed. And so in a lot of ways, then it requires the player's knowledge, right? It requires the player's intention to kind of get there. Whereas in the context of a one step to extreme power, like in Binding of Isaac, where you get those specific items,
Hmm.
uh, you don't need to know anything.
Yeah.
You walk over and suddenly kaboom. And then
Sure.
Slay the Spire, it's a fewer set of steps, so it happens randomly more often, which is nice because that's how you learn about it. Um,
Hmm.
but it's easier to create those conditions too because you have to bring together fewer pieces, right? Kind of like what am I trying to remember? The guy that has the orbs, and then kind of
The defect, I think.
yeah, and then kind of defeating the third stage of it before you kind of get habituate trying to go for this fourth stage.
Hmm.
uh, you learn the ropes of how to kind of get this endless like orb spam psycho situation going, and getting to the end of 3 becomes almost predictable. I mean, of course, Slay the Spire can't isn't it doesn't end up getting to truly predictable, and that would be a problem if it did. But it's easier to manufacture those kinds of results than it is to in Hades, for example.
Hmm. And I think that's a really good point there about kind of the steps or the preparation you need to do to reach that point. And like with Haze itself, like we said, you have the mirror. We haven't talked about the keepsakes yet. I think we'll spend like a minute on that next. You have the keepsakes, you have the weapons, and then you have whatever boons show up. And it is very much kind of like like this mishmash of abilities that lead to this incredible power. But I think one of the big things about Hades is that the game doesn't necessarily, I think, punish you for not getting it. Like if you're good enough at the general combat, who cares? What punishments you get, who cares what boons you take? You'll win the game. Even if it takes you, 50 minutes to an hour or more, you'll win that run possibly on just pure skill alone. But as we've said with a lot of like the brilliance of games like Slay the Spire and so on, that when you do get it and it does click, it almost feels like you've just uncovered what the developers didn't want you to know. And we've said that before about when the player feels like they're getting one over on the developers and the game. They get that thrill of haha, I just figured out, I just broke your game.
Yeah, I very much like that feeling, right? And creating that feeling, what's weird is like the player perspective is that they're breaking the game because they've gained power so much faster than it made sense, right?
Hmm.
But that can totally be intentional, and often for the good games, it is.
Yeah.
There's like a kind of like a shorthand I like using with some of my game dev friends, where we talk about things in terms of 110, 1000. It's a funny joke because obviously it seems more like 110, 100, and we're trying to talk about exponential or sharp gains. And then the 110, 1000 is just like kind of like a magnitude joke about how you skip that you really what you want to do is surprise a user's expectation by having things like extreme power gain at a rate you weren't expecting. This
Hmm.
I look over to the left every now and then because I have Hades up, and I'm kind of like creeping through rooms and trying to find inspiration. but um, but yeah, this you want to build into any game. You want to build a you need to build explosions into your game, and those explosions can come in almost any form. And by explosion, I really only mean that you know that things go in a particular direction, or you know certain things happen, and inevitably they happen at a certain rate,
Hmm.
and you want to allow for conditions to come together to allow that rate to occasionally dramatically go up.
Yeah.
And in doing so, it creates like a rush of exhilaration for the user. And and kind of if we want to talk like kind of like gambling mechanics, it helps create an emotional spike that connects us to what we're doing.
Hmm.
And maybe it's more addictive in that regard. But I mean, I think we all strive to, through the way we socialize with each other, to be more addictive to others, I think. Um,
Hmm.
um, but that said, if you don't do that, right, some of the most essential things about the experience that are meant to be memorable or need to be memorable can't happen. And so, sorry to go on such a long tirade just about about getting extra powerful fast, but that's the general position I have with respect to it.
Yep, and like I think as you said, like it really creates like those emotional attachments or those runs. I always say it's kind of like it creates like those like periods in the sentence for how these runs play. Like you remember when things go crazy in a roguelike or any game like this. And it's like when you start to chase those feelings again, it kind of keeps you invested. Like, okay, this last run, I completely screwed up. My build just went completely pear shaped, but it was so weird and wacky. Maybe I can try it again, and maybe this time I can get it to work. Maybe instead of taking buff A, I take buff C, and the whole suddenly this whole run is now 1,000 times different. And it really does kind of like it gives like these games I think a greater sense of personality with like that sense of replayability. Like if we played a traditional game, like a 20 to 30 hour long RPG, and something goes wrong, it's like, oh my god, you tell me I gotta restart, I screwed up my whole build, I gotta do all this stuff again. But in a roguelike, it's like, okay, that failed. What's plan 57 C now that I can try in this next build?
Um, yeah, everything you said was kind of cracking me up because yeah, it's like the those that kind of it. What am I trying to say? Because it's starting with the way our brains interact with those rules, right? And trying to come up with like those the strategies. And inevitably a lot of us are going to read stuff on the internet to try to find the certain strategies as well. But there is a kind of endless fun to coming up with cockamamie strategies, like
Mm-hmm.
strategies that will never work, and that you're just trying them out and you try to force them to work, and you have all these thoughts around it, and there's opportunities. In this case, now it is literally stuff the developer never thought, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you're putting bananas and vinegar together, and you're just keep trying different ratios because one of them might taste good.
Yeah.
And it's a great part of the fun. Oh, what's interesting about that too is it kind of reminds me of some articles I've seen out there kind of talking about the gamer mentality and conspiracy theories, that like we're inclined to explore very strange
Mm-hmm.
intersections, right? And as gamers, we're well suited to exploring those very strange corners and niches. And we get in there, we want to see if something is up. And I think you see when a developer creates like the right set of generality and systemic interrelation in their mechanics, we just eat it up, right? We need to browse that uncertainty and make understand how all of its little pieces work together. Seriously, in a lot of ways, like completionism is really just the is really it's like the is the processed sugar version of what we're really after, right? Which is to understand how
Mm-hmm.
all the mechanics work in a game.
Yeah. I mean, how many gamers here raise your hand if you jumped into a pit in a game thinking of trying to find there was a secret treasure chest or there was a bonus path down a death pit? And yeah, like trying to again, like this is one of the reasons why we like as a kind of a weird little tangent why we always talk about how good early access is for developers of games like this because gamers, as you said, they will look down every nook and cranny. They will data mine. They will do everything they can to figure out how to play this game. And if you have a game that is built on, millions of possible variations, well, if you have a group of 500 to 1,000 people who are going to obsessively look over every piece of it, it certainly makes it a lot easier to find those moments. And I go back to Tim Keenan, who did Duskers from, I think this was like 3, 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And he said that no way he could have looked at every part of his game if he didn't, by himself, he needed those early access testers to figure these things out. And that is, again, like one of the beauty and nightmare when we talk about procedural generation.
Well, you know, the the designers that are good at this have had enough. They've done well. There are many aspects of it, but I'm going to pick two of them that matter. They've done enough weightlifting that they can accommodate in their imagination a certain degree of complexity. And
Mm-hmm.
inside that complexity, they have confidence that the results will fit inside of their expectations. Now, inevitably, there'll be results that don't, but you can very quickly spot it. So I think if you come into this kind of a systems design situation with zero experience, which everybody has to at first, you'll see all this possibility and you won't be able to categorize it. One of the side effects of that is you won't be able to know if it's something that you like or not. And therefore, you won't know what changes to the system you should make to promote certain results over others. So that's one side of it, right? That experience really helps. And then the other side of it is your imagination. You're being able to imagine particular results that are interesting, right? And that's kind of the more creative side of it. And everything we do that's creative is really just going like, I imagined doing something that I liked,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe particularly didn't like, because that can be useful too, right? Having you be unhappy briefly right before we hit you with something happy is actually a very, very effective device. And for the kind of new designers, a bit of recommendation is take this sentence and keep it in your mind. You want to pool strategic boredom
Mm-hmm.
to set yourself up for tactical tactical drama. Anyways, uh shoot, saying that totally erased what I was saying.
and like trying to manage like those highs and lows. I think that's another area where Hades works really well. I think this is probably a good moment to kind of segue and talk more about the story and narrative because this is a major part of Hades, and of course, like a major part of what Supergiant does with a lot of their games. As a
And
quick,
always
just as a quick time check, we are about to hit an hour in. I don't know what your schedule looks like for today.
I am good for till what is it? 5:50 your time.
Okay, so another 20 minutes. Okay,
Yeah.
got it. All right, and if you guys have any questions or comments and such, let us know as well. So, kind of switching gears a little bit, talk about the story of Hades. I think this is one of those aspects that it, from like traditional roguelike fans, it doesn't sound like that big of a deal to have, this very engrossing narrative to the run based design. but I think it really has helped the appeal of Hades kind of for more mainstream audiences.
Well, it's a terribly reductive statement, but I would say that for all experiences, in a lot of ways, all that matters is the story. Now, the moment I say that, everyone listening will think of all the reasons why things other than the story matter. And my only answer to that is I lump all that stuff into the story, right? Whatever is the cohesive singular thing that is their experience, that's the story. And so it can be a story consisting entirely of mechanics. But
Mhm.
obviously, like a story with characters and emotions and a mythology to a universe and its rules, by setting it in that story, that helps us understand things better. And if we understand things better, we're connected better. We're engaged stronger. We're less inclined to step away. We're less inclined for our minds to be distracted from what's going on because we have all these great tools to understand what's right in front of us. And so the story isn't so much there to know what happens next. The story's there to organize and create a
Mhm.
rationale for theoretically every little thing you do. If there's a rule between the degree of percent increase in hit points because of some mirror based upgrade that's going to be permanent, and if you could figure out a way why that fits in with the logic of how the gods interact with each other in
Mhm.
this, sort of Greek-ish logic, Greek godish logic, then you like that mechanic better. It's so much more interesting. And I mean, to be fair, there's the what I used to describe as the most pretentious word in the game industry 10 years ago, which now I think is just a normal word. Ludonarrative dissonance is, you can mess it up. You're like, it was more convenient for me to make this mechanic work this way and it feels better. But my story setting is in conflict with it and you feel it when it's like that. To be fair,
Mhm.
us gamers are more than capable of overcoming almost any amount of ludonarrative dissonance, considering the history of games. But the flip side is when you get it right, it feels better. And Hades definitely did an extremely elegant job of making their gameplay and all their mechanics and their RPG and the way you think about solving problems in the game fit kind of perfectly with their story, right?
Mhm. Yeah, and to Chris's point again about the persistent elements in roguelikes and that sense of growing more in power, it really relates well to the story of the game. That Zagreus is using more of the mirror, which is giving him more power from Nyx, and the weapons themselves growing more powerful as you dedicate your time to them, which unlocks their various aspects. And again, like this also is a really good point of the heirlooms. That as you befriend the various people, they'll give you these various items that will help you, which then further allow you to find your build, which then makes you want to talk to them more to unlock more stuff. And
And
it's
dude,
just
that
a
talking. Oh, go ahead, go ahead.
I was gonna it's just like that perfect feedback loop of story to gameplay.
Yeah, and I love how it makes you talk to the characters and
Mhm.
want to talk to them.
Yeah.
And then, of course, because it's mechanical at first, you talk to them and you don't care what they say.
Yeah.
But because you have to do it so many times, you know what they say. And so
Mm-hmm.
you get the story as a result. It's fantastic. It really very impressed. I mean, it's not like I haven't been impressed with Supergiant the whole time.
Yeah.
Um, but um
I,
but Hades does seem like this strange like pinnacle of the work that
mm-hmm.
they've done the thus far. Actually, plug a friend of mine, a guy named Jim Shepard. He makes a game. He made a game called Dungeon Man's.
Okay.
It's a roguelite.
Have to play that
Has
one.
some great legacy features for like you basically you create characters out of this like dungeon adventure academy, and
Okay.
so the characters go and they die, of course, right? But then they advance the academy. And then there are great little features. If like a higher level character dies somewhere and you find their body, you get a fairly powerful upgrade of a weapon with that character's name as part of the item. Like all these little details, super good stuff. You know, and it's something like with Epic Tavern that we care a lot about is what is your history with this
Mm-hmm.
game? What is the mark that you've put on it? Because it's kind of a way to cheat, right? By having it be your playthrough, or having it be what you authored, now it's absolutely unique. And in the context of Hades, there's so much variability in how you approach it. The specific path you take does become, or at least feels, fairly unique.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And that kind of that kind of idea of as the players being forced to witness a story and then it kind of grows on them. That was Dungeon. Yeah, got it. Like it is such a clever way, and as you said, this kind of feels like like the best interpretation of what Supergiant has been doing for like I think what are they like 12 somewhere around I think 11, 12 years at this point. I always forget
Yeah.
when Bastion came out, and you can see this kind of focus on making the story fit the gameplay. You said earlier about low narrative dissonance that we don't feel it as much again as gamers. Like, as people know, I am mechanics first, story second and third. So low narrative dissonance means like very little to me. But when games do it right, or when they kind of avoid that issue, it often leads to that richer experience, as we saw with Hades. Like, one of my favorite things about the game that I know people have praised on is the writing and the characterizations. That it's not just a character repeating the same line of dialogue every time you talk to them. I think someone said there's over like 15,000 lines of spoken dialogue in this game now, and so much of that adds to this flavor that you're not just listening to somebody say the same thing. You're hearing them comment on what you did on the previous one. They're commenting on what items you have, what upgrades you've chosen, and it all again fits into their each respective personality.
Yeah, and I really like there's something at a very like high level philosophical level, or kind of morality level, or empathy level, or community level. The idea that if I spend time playing a game and you do and you play that game as well, that we are becoming closer to each other. We're becoming more like each other, right? We have a shared experience, even though we weren't there at the same time. And so like video games and internet just in general kind of like uh really from like at least in this logic that I from that I'm thinking about, really brings people together. And we've all felt it, right? You get
Mm-hmm.
on some voice chat with some stranger and you don't know anything about them, but they've played this game that you're playing with them a lot, and you have all this stuff you can talk about because you guys have like it's like I know the politics of Destiny. And we can have different opinions about whether you're in favor of the changes they're making to light and darkness as they go forward or whatever. And now it's like no different than people at a bar talking about soccer clubs in the UK or something, right? And we know people connect very strongly over those things, even if they may very well be kind of on the surface.
Mm-hmm. And I just love the fact that with the story of Hades, that it fits the roguelike design. And this is something that I spent a little bit of time in my book talking about the idea of having narrative based roguelikes. And when we talk about this idea, most roguelikes are built on the idea that, you're playing as a hero, they die, you choose a new hero, they continue the quest. And while that works in kind of the short end of it, it doesn't really connect the world around the player. In many cases, the world is procedurally generated. With Hades, it is a world where everybody's immortal. So, you just killed that character. They're going to be waiting for you when you die and you're back at the hub area to talk about, how much you suck. Why didn't you get out this time? You beat me. And it just works really well, again, to build this world around this concept of something that, again, normally you don't think about, you know, immortality or the player being able to live, die, and repeat as part of the storytelling. That's usually kind of like secondary, almost like in Dark Souls, with the whole idea of being cursed and you are I always again forget the name of it. It's one of those things that I just like that blind spot. But the curse of in Dark Souls, that you're gonna become undead and then you're gonna go crazy. Thank you, Hollow. That it's there, but it's just kind of there as like the loose thing to explain why you keep coming back, but nobody ever references it in the game itself.
Yeah, and the more you reference it, the more like the goal is to create a mythology in the head of the player, right? Infinity Blade probably does a slightly better job of it from way back when, where it just explains why you're playing it over and over again. And that's like it's such a small step in some ways, but it's a really important thing to be considering when you're creating the experience. Now there can be a mythology to what you build,
Hmm.
but if the player doesn't know it, then it doesn't affect
Yeah.
their appreciation of it, and it doesn't give them a framework upon which to record their experiences with your product. And so, it's like the more when we see great examples like this, I think, Portal is a really good example of how the story can supercharge the choices you're making in the experience. I just referenced Destiny, right? Like creating a logic for why you respawn, for example. um, Paranoia, the RPG, that you have clones. All these things on the surface sometimes seems kind of chintzy. You're like, oh, you don't need to explain that. We get it. But that's not. They're not doing it just for that. Well, I mean, sometimes people can have whatever motive they want, but the best reason to do that is to create a unique kind of like proprietary shell that you use in your mind to put the memories of my product in, right? And now there's so many benefits to that. It's a human to human interaction to kind of get their attention better, to hold it better, to have a more concrete relationship with the player.
Hmm. Yeah. And just reading the comments in chat again, that it is. I think it's a lot harder than as we're describing this to get this balance right, and he's just really navigates that well with again trying to bring everything into this space and making it believable. And again, there's a difference between making something realistic and making something believable. I think that's easily another topic for another day. Now, I know we have about 10 minutes, maybe a little less than that before you have to go. One last thing I wanted to discuss about Haze, I think is very important, is we spent some time talking about making the game more accommodating towards new players. But I also want to talk about how they kind of stretch things out for expert players with its progressive difficulty. Now, you haven't had a chance to use the pack of punishment yet, and I've had a chance to use it quite a bit to make life very hard for me. And the pack of punishment, I think, is a brilliant system in this game because it lets, I've been saying this for a while, it lets the player essentially choose, how long the rope they want to hang themselves with. It's not the game saying, oh, we're just going to make this harder because, we want to punish you. It's, you want to reward yourself, how much do you really want to reward yourself kind of thing.
I mean, that's the beauty of it, right? If you were to create such an elegant system of action mechanics and a series of enemies that can tolerate scaling, and um, if you don't deliver tools to kind of explore the higher levels of difficulty, that's think of it as gameplay that someone would be interested in that you're just not allowing to happen. Now, to be
Hmm.
fair, it takes work, right, to create the right kinds of game modes and rules to kind of push players into a harder space that's valid, because you can make something basically impossible, right? It's like if I'm let's say you're going to play World of Warcraft and you're going to make
Hmm.
it so Hogger can be killed but just takes 45 minutes or something.
Hmm.
Not a ton of people are going to like that, right?
Yeah.
Some people will, because especially if you put an achievement behind it, they're willing to do any amount of self-punishment to do it. It could be 8 hours if there was an achievement and somebody would do it.
Oh, yes.
But that most people wouldn't enjoy that. And there's some skill in creating both a system and a game mode a core system and a game mode that would accommodate increase in difficulty that's interesting. But once that opportunity's there, if you don't do it, it's like you're just like saying, I don't want you to do it.
Hmm. And yeah, I think that is kind of like one of the big differences in where we see difficulty changing in the last 10 years, or even maybe in the last 5 years when it comes to developers. That it's not, and this is something that I'm actually writing a post about difficulty about as well, that it's not about designing the game only for the super hardcore masochistic achievements. It's about designing a game that it can accommodate somebody who doesn't want that stuff, and they'll get an experience, just as somebody who wants that masochistic level can get their own experience for it. And I think like something like with Hades works really well. That if you want to make Hades very easy, you can do that. If you want to make it very difficult, you can do that as well. And the game is never saying, oh, you must play it this way, or we're designing it so only 5% of the player base will ever beat this game.
Yeah, no, and I think Supergiant Games has a really solid history of having a very fine and nuanced understanding of what it means to make a product for as close to everyone as possible. I think that that's a very sophisticated idea. I think a lot of developers don't quite understand that, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so many of us believe in right or wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And right or wrong, that means if a player isn't in the right, then they're wrong. And certainly I'm allowed to make something that isn't directed at you, for example, as a player. But
Mm-hmm.
the game has it doesn't use it serves very little for me to tell you that you're wrong for approaching it in a particular way, right? Um, and there's also like a lot of mentality of like punishing failure. There's very little upside to that in many games. Now, some games
Mm-hmm.
are about punishment, but then it's different. Dark Souls doesn't really punish you. It's just like something it does that didn't work.
Yeah.
That didn't work either. That didn't work. It's like a it ha- if you look through all the game experiences that we put a lot of time into, I think we'll find that there's um, that success scales with a fixation on why things work rather than why they don't, um, or what is it? Positive reinforcement versus punitive.
Yeah.
Those things, like even in a game that is as punishing as well, you know what I would say? Games like if we go back to a game like Ninja Gaiden, for example, it's unnecessarily punitive, and
Mm-hmm.
that'll push a lot of players out. It didn't push me out, and people like me, especially when I was younger, uh, feel like that the punishing nature or the difficulty of the experience is like a badge of honor. And so
Mm-hmm.
when people like me grow up and we make games, we kind of start off like trying to make that badge of honor available for players, not realizing that that badge of honor's presence also pushes out a lot of players that I wasn't like.
Yeah.
And anyways, that's a long tirade just to say Supergiant does a good job in that regard.
Mm-hmm. And yet, I said the same thing in the post that I'm writing right now, that a lot of difficulty in games in the past were designed to punish people. You run out of lives, you start back at the beginning. You die, your weapon gets taken away. And that stuff, it doesn't bother the core fans because A, they're used to it, and B, they're good enough that it doesn't matter to them. I've talked about this before with games like La Mulana, uh, so many other like independent or indie like super difficult titles, like Getting Over It as well. That when you're good at these games, those systems are meaningless, but they're not meaningless to the people who are still trying to learn them. And it is very what's that expression? You can catch more flies with honey than vinegar, or whatever that expression is.
Totally,
That
totally, totally.
if you want people to play your game, you don't want to punish somebody just for pressing start. And one of the things that Hades does really well, again, and what we're seeing a lot more games do these days, like Slay the Spire and Monster Train, is say that I have a normal, the basic way to beat my game is for everybody. If we go on a scale of -10 to 10 in terms of difficulty, normal is, let's say, 0. If you're not good at the game, you can lower it down to -3, -5. You can go as far as -10, and you're still going to be able to play my game. But that's where I think a lot of developers kind of stop. Where we see the improvement is saying, okay, so you do want more challenge. Well, why don't you do this? And then you can start pushing to +3, +7, +10, and you'll get an experience that is just as valid. And again, as I'm describing this, it sounds so much easier when I'm saying it, but it is very much not.
Yeah. Well, there's a chance that it is easy. It's just that it took us as an industry some time to disabuse ourselves of certain attitudes.
Hmm.
Because if you were to catch me 20 years ago, I just have a very different perspective
Yeah.
on a lot of these topics, and there are topics that I would just been like really doggedly, like stubbornly holding on to and arguing about. That today I'm just like, you should approach it how you want to.
Hmm. Yep.
That it's a zero impact one way or the other, and that the time you're spending then becomes part of the problem.
Yep. And I think, like, to begin to wrap things up, because I know we're just about hitting on time,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Let's go further.
that Hades, I feel, is just a brilliant encapsulation of, I think, what you said at the beginning of this cast, kind of like where we can see roguelike or roguelike inspired games go. That it is very much run base, but there's also this narrative that runs through it. It is very difficult, or it can be, but you can also play it, just to experience a story. It's very much like that, almost like an everyman's roguelike. But I know that can seem like I'm insulting the game, I'm diminishing it, but it works because it can appeal to so many levels. And I feel like this is one area where traditional roguelike developers uh, are still messing up on. That they adhere so much to the old school mentality, both in UI and UX design, that it's not really opening up the genre to them. And I said this in my book. There are probably more people who know Slay the Spire, Binding of Isaac, and FTL than they will have ever have played the original Rogue or NetHack, or even like modern examples like Cogmine and Caves of Quid.
Was there a question packed into that?
No, that was just my kind of like final thought
Ah,
rambling there.
well, let me see. I think I can do a final thought rambling as well.
Mhm.
Um, I think it's interesting. Hades
Mhm.
as we'll call it, at least for today-ish, right? Kind of a advancement in the roguelite genre, and that it be so kind of democratic and open to all, and fundamentally it's similarly a quality experience for someone who is not that into this kind of game, for as well as for people who are very much into the kind of game. That's interesting, an interesting end result, considering that the starting point for rogue like games that led to roguelike games is something that was very much the old school mentality, right? Like almost like designed with harshness as a
Mhm.
as an essential ingredient in its recipe. So I think I find that a sort of an interesting and thought-provoking shift.
Mm. And again, going back to what you said earlier about many people treating difficulty as a badge of honor, I have seen that on many different forums and Steam game chat or Steam forums as well for hard games. That if the game is made easier in some respect, it's like it's diminishing the quality of the game for everyone else. And there are a lot of people, I feel, and this is definitely, I think, a greater discussion we can have at some point, who equate difficulty to gameplay. That if a game's not difficult, it's not good. And what we're seeing, I think, is that you can have a good game that doesn't, mercilessly punish new players and can still have that bite or edge for people who want it, but it's not forced upon them.
Yeah, I think that bears a very important piece of additional information. The audience of gamers has changed
Hmm.
and has changed quite a bit, especially in the last 10 years, right?
Yes.
We've gone from a certain number of even console players, but really global players have gone from a small-ish number to a large-ish number, or a smallish percentage to a large-ish percentage. It is insane how the center, or like the center of the totality of all gamers, their perspective has moved an enormous distance. And
Hmm.
back in the day, a game that was punishing like that, it fit the ethos of the audience much better than it does today. And you don't have to make a game for everybody, but if you do, you have a better chance of selling more copies, being more successful, right? Setting yourself up to be able to do it again.
Yeah, and I guess one final point, because I know somebody will probably argue this down in the comments. That when we say making a game accessible to everyone, we're not saying designing a game with universal appeal. We're saying allowing people to enjoy your game, regardless of kind of like a singular focus. Like, my game is only meant for the 5% of people out there who enjoy super difficult Kaizo games versus saying, here's a platformer that if you're a fan of platformers, you can play it, but you can also go, the super Kaizo difficulty route, and my game accommodates both those play styles.
I certainly like that a lot. And
And,
I mean, nowadays, I think before I would have played a particular way because I felt that it was right or wronger.
mhm,
And now it's like, will that work? Let's see.
yeah. And to Chris's point, I think as long as the hardcore mode is balanced in the game, that it's not just we're going to take this game and we're just going to turn on permadeath. I think that's a different story. Like I played Grim Dawn last night, and all of a sudden I looked down at chat and looked up, and my character died, and I lost an hour of progress. But I think that is a good point with me failing to get good. I think that's a good point to end our discussion on.
Nice.
So So, Tomo, as always, thank you so much for coming on. We try to have these little discussions once a month along with our monthly roundtables. For those of you watching this live right now, our previous roundtable should be going up very soon from the time of this posting. And for people watching, if you have anything you'd like to plug, Tomo, feel free to go ahead.
Yeah, so my studio, Hyperkinetic Studios, makes a game called Epic Tavern. We're still in development. The game is in early access. It is available on Steam presently. We stream development 3 times a week at twitch.tv/Epic Tavern, and we have regular discussions about storytelling, game development, and Epic Tavern's world and mechanics at our Discord channel, Discord GG/Epic Tavern, and we twice a week have voice channel developer conversations with the audience. And so, if you found any of this interesting, I'd love to see you at either of those places and discuss more in depth. Actually, I'm watching a little bit of kind of an interesting conversation emerge in chat about pricing and the logic behind pricing, and it's starting to suck my brain in. So Romanov, Alexi, if you end up at Josh's Discord channel, I'd be more than willing to share some of my thoughts about your point of view.
And maybe we can do that as one of our roundtable discussions too at some point.
Pricing is crazy. There's a
Oh,
lot going on there,
yes.
and there's a lot of data that can't really easily be explained. It's something that's happening in the chat is that, you know, a common argumentation tactic is to say that because of this, therefore this must be true. Um, but that's rarely effective because there's so much hidden information and uncertainty. So
Mhm.
the combining of practical outputs that have been measured, so people that have sold things and their experience, combined with ultimately a deeper dive into kind of the behavioral economics of why consumers make their choices is necessary to kind of start digging out more predictable conclusions.
Right. So I think with that, we will wrap things up. So for everybody watching this live recording, thank you for tuning in. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Like I said, we will be back next month for another game discussion and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. Until next time, everybody, have a great rest of your night.
Thanks, folks.